How do you go from product market fit to unicorn status? Let's talk about the sales tactics that get you there on this episode of Closing Time. Thanks for tuning into Closing Time, the show for go-to-market leaders. I'm Val Riley, VP of Marketing at Insightly and Unbounce. Today, I'm joined by Stijn Hendrikse. He is a go-to-market coach and author of T2D3, a playbook for mastering software startups. Thanks for joining us, Stijn.
Thanks for having me, Val. Great to be here.
Awesome. So I'm going to start off with the title of your book, T2D3, and ask you to tell us what it means.
T2D3 stands for tripling your revenue 2 years in a row, or your ARR, your recurring revenue, and then doubling it 3 more years in a row. It was a very common term coined really in the VC world. In 2015, I think that's when you started to hear it a lot. There was a managing partner with Battery Ventures who was credited with the coining of that acronym, but it was so common at some point that people started to ask, and I was in this space, how do you do it? And you got so many different answers. And there was definitely some kind of playbook to it, or some form of method, but it was definitely not well defined, and it was not documented at all. There were so many books around, how do you get from 0 to 1, the lean startup, how do you get going, but how do you get kind of through that next stage after you got to 1, how do you get to 10? There was far less of that, and that's what the book is about.
I'm sure you were super popular with all those VCs and PE firms. So let's go ahead and talk about the 6 kind of pillars for growth that are in the book. It starts with the first one, uncovering and choosing your company's growth priorities.
Yeah, it's one of the challenges when you have, let's say you hit product market fit. You found a market that likes your product, your service, and they're willing to pay you for it and stay, actually, right? That's the essence of a SaaS business, that people will retain. You can retain them as clients. But now growing beyond that product market fit sort of bar becomes really a multitasking effort, right? You cannot just stick with one demand gen lever. You have to have multiple. You have to invest in customer retention. You have to think about your pricing and packaging strategy, right? How do you improve your ACV? So all these things are starting to happen in parallel. You'll probably now have a board of directors, and you have a lot of well-intended advisors who will tell you what to do. So figuring out what of those bets you are really going to make is really critical. So that's number one.
Got it. Okay. So the next one, I've heard this term coined before, nailing your niche, right? Defining your identity, understanding your differentiation.
Yeah, when you, and of course, you know the CRM space very well, but if you're in a category that is starting to mature, and it's very hard to find a category in the software business that doesn't have already an existing set of players, right? Or providers of solutions. So if you're in that situation where you know that you have something really meaningful to offer for a group of customers who are not getting what they need today, maybe they get too little, they get too much, that is usually a subset of the category that you are competing in. And nailing, and that's what nailing a niche stands for, kind of what the dimensions of that new subsegment really are, and how you define that in a way that you can use that to focus where you put your sales focus, where you drive content marketing, etc., is really critical. And especially, again, when you've hit product market fit, you have this amazing asset that nobody else has, that you know some of these clients better than anyone else because they're with you, they have stayed with you for a while, so they can tell you a lot more about what they need. So nailing a niche is really about doubling down on that. And the niche can usually be relatively small as long as you're so relevant for these clients that it becomes very sticky, that they're not really having any reason to go somewhere else.
It feels like a lot of startups can get stuck here, trying to be jack of all trades, master of none, or not being willing to walk away from what could be maybe some lucrative deals because they're outside of that niche. So how do you coach them through that?
Yeah, and especially when you have gotten maybe a little bit of funding, or you have the luxury of profitability now, so you're able to invest in new areas. It is extremely hard to stay away from, let's say, bright, shiny objects, right? Opportunities that are meaningful, that are not necessarily not worth pursuing, but they can just not be pursued at the cost of losing focus, right? And so when you think of what happened in the last 2-3 years, especially in the SaaS world, Val, that funding has been a little harder to come by, right? And investors are expecting a little, more return on their, the go-to-market dollars. This is actually becoming easier because it's far easier now. So there was a world before, like the late 2021 is really when the kind of the SaaS investment bubble like not bursted, but reset a little bit. Before that, there was this environment of grow more, grow at any cost in any way, right? And we'll talk about profitability later, right? Those days are over. So it's a little easier now whether it's at a board level or in your executive team or even with your marketing team, it's a little easier to make the case for, hey, let's not try 5 things. Let's do 2 or 3 really, really well. Ideally do 1 well, right? Or do 1 this week, right? And then we'll do the other 1 next week. Right? It doesn't mean you close those doors, but being extremely focused will allow you to really nail a niche and build some form of a moat around it, right? That you can defend that against the competition, even if your product is not much better. But by just focusing on a very specific part of the market better than anyone else, that in itself is competitive differentiation.
I got to say, as a marketer who was working in the 20 teens during growth at all costs, it certainly was fun, but not sustainable. So I agree that those days are definitely over. So there's 2 next on your list. One is build a modern marketing function and maintain its focus, which super important, that second part. And then knowing, sizing, and segmenting and defining your audience. So both of these feel like they're firmly within marketing and sales to me.
Yeah, and building a modern marketing function, I'm not going to spend too much time. It makes sense, right, to have people who understand the latest use of technology, right, and understand like how you do TikTok these days instead of YouTube, right? Especially if you want to, even in B2B, Val, I hear that almost 70% of decisions now is being influenced or made through TikTok content, because maybe the decision makers are millennials, they're still in the YouTube generation, but the people in their teams who do a little bit of the research, who help they're more on the TikTok generation. So anyway, but that's maybe less interesting for the audience. What on the knowing and sizing and segmenting kind of that market, that niche, you've probably heard the term TAM, SAM, SOM, right? Total addressable market, serviceable part of that market, and then the serviceable part of the market that you can realistically obtain. I've mostly seen challenges with that last step. It's very common for people to describe the total addressable market as kind of, hey, this is the opportunity, this is why we are excited about this is why we're going to invest in a certain campaign, etc. And then people are relatively good with saying, well, we're not going to be able to service the total addressable market. There's only a part of that market that's going to be interested in what we have to offer, or better, who can actually use what we have to offer. And that's where you hear terms like ICP, right? What's the ideal customer profile? Who are the personas that we're trying to service? That's usually that step from TAM to SAM. But the last step is almost more important, that you also are realistic. Even if the serviceable addressable market is relatively large, what part of that market can we obtain given the amount of resources we have, the amount of time we have, the amount of languages that we can support, or local, execution, etc. And that last part I often see is not really done well. And that leads to a practical example. If you run paid ads, right, which is still something that works today, although it's not as easy anymore. But doing that, for example, with a limited budget in a couple of zip codes, only a certain amount of time of the week, makes it much easier to win those auctions and to optimize than trying to run ads in the whole country and during the whole week, right? And so it's an example where when you are realistic of what part of the market can you really obtain, it also becomes easier to make your execution a lot higher ROI.
That TAM number can seem kind of sexy, but you're right. Getting it down to something that's truly achievable, it takes some discipline. Next, you say we want to focus on creating relevant messaging for the entire customer journey. I think people sometimes get it right on the front side of that, but getting it right through the whole journey, I think, is a challenge in and of itself.
Yeah, I started my marketing career. I was a software developer first, and at Microsoft, I somehow morphed into becoming a marketer. And when I started, I was in B2B, and that's where I've been most of my life. I did marketing for the SMB, small and medium business segment at Microsoft. And the last 10 years, I've focused mostly on smaller software companies servicing B2B. And one of the things that I always kind of cracked my teeth on is that we used personas that were more like consumer style personas that describe what someone likes, how they, when they bring their kids to school, they're all those things which are interesting for when you think of the individual and you want to capture their attention and you want to capture their engagement, etc. But what I find is a missing step is that in the B2B world of marketing and sales, that the persona might be the same individual, but the role they play and the way they behave really changes during the journey. So if you think of the journey, let's simplify it to really these 3 stages of like awareness and consideration and conversion, right? When you think of the typical marketing sales funnel, what happens in B2B, where in B2B, people are trying to spend someone else's money, right? That's the biggest difference with B2C, is that in that first stage, awareness, you might be marketing to people who are the receivers of your solution. They're the potential users. They will say, hey, this is important. We need a solution for this specific problem that I encounter in my role. That's a different type of persona than the person maybe in the consideration part of the journey who gets tasked with the research to, hey, what type of options are out there? How do we compare this solution versus that one? How do we think about the budget that we need to acquire this solution? And then the third stage of the funnel, the conversion part, is usually influenced by another part of the kind of the B2B decision tree, which are the people who have to sign off on something, who have to approve something. It could be people in IT, in legal, in procurement. So you have kind of these 3 stages of the funnel that often require a different approach to the personas. And even if you're marketing to smaller businesses where this individual could be the same person who is both, hey, we need this and let's look at some options and should we do this today or postpone it till next year? That's kind of what happens in these 3 stages of the funnel, right? Why do we need this? Why you and why now? If you don't think about those distinct, then your content is just not going to have the same relevance, right? And the messaging, where you in the first stage have to really think about how do I convince someone to care, where in the consideration part of the funnel is much more about how do I convince them that we are the right option, right? And then in the last stage of the funnel, you're not really convincing anybody anymore. You're helping the person who's already convinced to convince everybody else in the organization to sign off on the purchase order or whatever the next step in the funnel is.
And potentially defending against other competitors at that last stage too, right?
Oh,
so you really have to nail it.
Yeah, the best tactic that I've seen complex software vendors use when they are kind of losing a deal is to create a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt in the last stage of the funnel, right? And then hope to live another day and maybe be able to bid again in a couple of months. Yeah.
Right. So the last phase, I'm really excited that you zeroed in here on account-based marketing, because I think, especially for startups, it can really be an economically viable way to market and sell, like in a manner that really gets you focused, hyper-focused on the right people. So why account-based marketing?
Yeah, the caveat here, Val, is that ABM, account-based marketing, is defined by many people in different ways. Mm-hmm. The way I'm thinking of it, again, in a B2B context, is that you kind of know what your ideal customer profile looks like, and you define that as a typical an organization, right, an account, and you're trying to get a really sort of strong campaign that's targeted at building out relationships within that account. And the biggest challenge that you see here, especially with smaller companies who start doing ABM, is that they're not willing to kind of put the effort in to this being a longer term investment. Football season has just started, and I liken to kind of. I think of this a little bit as the running game. When you start running the football, and sorry for people outside of the United States, but I'm talking about American football. If you start running the football, one of the things you're doing in that first quarter is trying to see where the kind of the softness of the defense is, right? What are the holes that we can open up? And account-based marketing typically starts a little bit. It's more like outbound marketing, where you're sending out emails, you send out LinkedIn requests, maybe there are other channels that you use, and you're trying to kind of see what lists that we have are working, what type of channel is working, what content is resonant. It's a lot of A/B testing, a lot of figuring things out. But that can take a little bit of time, right? It takes a couple of months, especially when you want to understand and do something with those learnings and make them statistically relevant. So now you have to go into that second quarter and sticking with it, because now you're probably able to create the messaging and the content that's actually going to resonate. You will see some early conversions, but those still will not be customers that are paying you. They might be prospects that now suddenly show up for a sales conversation, right? And so you need kind of that third quarter to actually see this turn into revenue. And a lot of things that happen in outbound marketing don't get enough time to mature and to have that type of learning for it to become effective. And that's really sad, because if you are a relatively early stage company, if you're still trying to build the market, make the market, right? You're trying to nail that niche. You're an expert. You are going to have to knock on some doors. Inbound marketing, or let's call that demand capture, right? Where people already know they have a need. They're in the consideration stage of the funnel per the earlier point. They're like in that second level of persona. They're going to find you if you do a good job with like SEO, et cetera, and SEM. But there's probably an audience out there who you need to make aware of your solution, right? Demand generation, not just demand capture, demand generation. And for that, doing outbound in a way that is meaningful, that is relevant, where you're knocking on the right doors, is extremely critical. And there, having that level of patience, that also in a football game where a team that hangs on to that running game into the third quarter, they start to see results. Account-based marketing is all about that long game and having the relevant content. Be able, when you interrupt someone, to have enough added value that they at least not throw the flyer away, right? They archive your email instead of saying this is spam, right? And so that's really what an effective account-based marketing program could look like.
Well, Stijn, that's all the time we have for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us in Closing Time.
Thank you so much for having me, Val.
And thanks to everybody out there for tuning in. Remember, you want to like this video, subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for notifications, and you won't miss an episode. We will see you next week.